Hey folks, today I want to talk about a rifle that I'm extremely fond of and that pretty much changed the history of the world. That would be the M1 Garand 30-06. This rifle, I don't want to say was ahead of its time because they were looking for a semi-automatic rifle when this thing was actually developed, so it wasn't like it was such a novel idea that nobody else had thought of it. But the thing about it is it was so robust and well built and could handle so much water, dust, dirt, abuse, corrosion. It could handle all kinds of different environments. It was proven in all kinds of different environments. And that was what was so nice about it, because today we hear about firearms, oh, you can't shoot that one here, oh, you can't shoot that one there. This one here didn't have any of those problems. I want to talk a little bit about some of the details of the history of the Garand. Now, you can't talk about the Garand without talking about John Garand. Now, let me get this out of the way real quick, because I hear it from both sides every time I do anything on the Garand or talk about John Garand. Yes, it's the same spelling, the same name. John Garand spelled his name G-A-R-A-N-D, and he pronounced it Garand. However, whenever we built the M1, or he built the M1, and we adopted it as our rifle for the U.S. military, it was then called the M1 Garand by civilian folk. The military actually called the weapon the U.S. Rifle Caliber 30 M1. But again, it got the moniker of the M1 Garand. It was mispronounced as the M1 Garand, but that's how it is known as the M1 Garand. John Garand was French-Canadian. He was 12 years old when he came to the U.S. John Garand worked for Springfield Armory, the actual Springfield Armory, the one up in Massachusetts that built weapons for the United States government and our military. The U.S. military was looking for a new battle weapon, and they were looking for something in 30 caliber cartridge. They wanted it in semi-automatic, and I believe they were looking for something in the 6.5 pound realm. Back then, that was a stretch. There was no use of polymer materials back then. It was either steel or wood. So to get a 6.5 pound semi-automatic weapon, that was a long shot. So that was asking a lot. Needless to say, they did not get a 6.5 pound rifle in semi-automatic 30 caliber back then. It did not happen. The 1903 Springfield was the gun of choice back there. It was a bolt-action rifle, and they needed something to get rid of that. It was hyper slow as far as what needed to happen on the battlefield, and they really needed something that was going to auto-load. John Garand started working on a 30 caliber type of prototype that he could utilize. From 1928 to 1931, there were several variants of Garand's rifles, and they competed in military trials with the likes of designs by Pedersen, which was considered by the military or I should say highly promising. The military really liked Pedersen's design more than Garand's at the time. But again, the Garand competed with the likes of Pedersen, Thompson, Browning, Colt Browning, Holick, Rheinmetall, and White. Now, during these trials, Garand actually put together a rifle that utilized a .276 cartridge. And actually, that rifle was extremely effective throughout the trials. It actually was favored over most of the other rifles that were in this military competition for the standard issue rifle. Now, during a 1931 trial where the .276 beat out the Pedersen, the T1E1 Garand, remember that was the 30 caliber version, it actually was being tested as well, because remember, the military wanted that to begin with, so they were like, hey, why don't you test that one too? The problem was it acquired a cracked bolt during the testing, so it was disqualified. It was basically done away with at that time, and not really looked at very seriously again. So the T3E2 did really well. The problem was, again, it was in a .276 round. Well, in 1932, a change was recommended to the .276 round for use in the T3E2 Garand. However, Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur, you guys might remember that name, he denied adopting the .276 round. He wanted them to stick with the 30 caliber round. You see, at the time, there was a huge amount of surplus 30 round ammo waiting to be shot. So it didn't make any sense financially or logistically for the government to all of a sudden switch from a 30 caliber round that they desired in the first place to a .276, which was not even in production at the time, whenever, again, they were sitting on this stockpile of 30 caliber rounds. General MacArthur pretty much told them, fix the problems with the T1E1, basically the Garand and the 30 caliber, fix the problems, and we're gonna move on with that rifle. So they did. By January of 1936, the M1 Garand, the T1E3, was now the standardized military rifle. Now, when Springfield Armory decided to go ahead and start building the rifles, in 1937, they were putting out 10 rifles a day. They were making 10 of these a day. at Springfield Armory. That was their production quota. That was how much they could get out the door. Actually, that probably wasn't their quota. That's what they could get out. Now, within 2 years, they were putting out 100 rifles a day. By 1941, they were putting out 600 rifles a day. So you can see they gained some efficiency, and obviously they staffed up and probably had more facilities to build them in. They also had some help from the likes of Winchester Repeating Arms was actually manufacturing some of them too. So it wasn't all on Springfield Armory at that time. Now, by 1941, the Army was fully equipped with however many M1 Garands it needed at that time. In all, there were 5.5 million M1 Garands produced in total from all of the manufacturers that built them. This included all the way through the Korean War, when the likes of International Harvester, these guys made tractor equipment, farm equipment. They were actually making M1 Garands at the time too. And a little known fact is that Beretta actually made some M1 Garands utilizing some of the Winchester tooling at one point. That was something that not a whole lot of people are aware of. Now, what was interesting during all of the trials that were happening with the M1 Garand and the Pedersen rifles and all that, one of the things that basically made this M1 or the Garand version so much more popular and actually workable than the Pedersen model, because the Pedersen model, again, at one time it was considered highly promising by the U.S. military. They almost went with it. The problem with the Pedersen model was that the way the casing went into the chamber, once fired, it was the extractor basically grabbed the lip of the spent casing and pulled it straight back. The problem with that is when you have this massive explosion inside that chamber and your round now expands, so you have your brass round that was this size, and then you have the explosion, now it's this big, it's basically jammed, it's basically cooked, it's formed, it's made inside that chamber, it's mashed up against the walls. So then when you have that extractor that comes across the top, tries to grab that lip and pull it out, in many cases it would rip the lip straight off and the spent casing would remain in the chamber. What benefited the M1 Garand model, the T1 E1, was that using Garand's rotating bolt, what it did is it essentially grabbed the spent casing that, again, this rifle was no different as far as that casing expanding inside the chamber. But what happened was now it grabbed that expanded casing, and as it went to pull it out, it twisted and pulled it. Because again, you have this rotating bolt right here. And when that bolt twisted, it pretty much unseated and unstuck that spent casing that was stuck in that chamber, turned it and pulled it out. That made it extremely reliable. The problem that the Pedersen model had was that it had lubricated or wax-coated ammo that it had to use. It had to utilize that ammo or it simply wouldn't work. If you didn't have your waxed ammo, you were going to be in for a long day because you were going to have that lip getting torn off and your casing stuck in there. Look, when we were at a time looking for a war rifle, the last thing we needed to do was find a firearm that needed a specific type of ammo. God forbid there'd be no wax or lubricant on there, because then our troops would be in a bind. The government didn't want any kind of rifle that had to utilize a specialized ammunition that had a certain type of coating on it. That's why the Pedersen didn't make it. This guy right here, the rotating bolt, is what saved the day. All in all, the Garand was produced until about 1957. It was a great battle rifle for the time, but other rifles just passed it up. You had rifles that were holding 30 rounds, 20 rounds and 30 rounds and more, and they weren't quite as heavy, weren't quite as bulky. Obviously, you know that the United States government moved on from the M1 Garand to the M14 or the M1A. So the box fed, that made a big difference also. It was just time. It was time for a change. Of course, we know the Garand pretty much won the war for us in World War II. I mean, what would we have done without it? You know, there's a lot of stories that you hear from a lot of the old guys out there that respect the generation that we have that will tell you, you know, they were able to get on target and fire 8 shots, and they're looking at Germans across from them that had bolt action rifles that only held 5 shots. So we're sitting here not having to actually work the action at all until time to put our next clip in there with rounds, and it is called a clip, by the way, in this gun. And they're watching the Germans who are taking 1 shot, pulling back, getting down, because they don't want to stand up in the line of fire to chamber that next round, to eject the spent casing and chamber the next round. So they're constantly getting off target and taking their eyes off target. So they're getting off target with their gun and they're taking their eyes off target. They're doing that 5 times and then they have to reload the weapon completely. Where our guys are sitting there for 8 turns in a row shooting this thing, and then they just slap another clip in there full of rounds at that point. This thing really revolutionized the way war took place, and don't think a lot of people didn't take notice. You see what the Germans did very quickly after seeing what we had going with this thing. The M1 Garand was also used quite a bit in the Korean War, but of course that's about the time that you started seeing other weapons come in there, more notably at some point the M1A, and of course going into Vietnam, these were used sparingly. In Vietnam, you hardly saw any of these guys, but there were some out there, again, the M1A, and then eventually the M16 took over in Vietnam. So these things were phased out pretty quickly going into the late 50s and the early 60s, but they still were used in light use in many areas. This particular model I have right here, this is serial number 611609. It's pretty cool. You can go onto a lot of different websites out there and you can trace back where your receiver and where the different parts come from. Of course, this is the only part that I have that's serialized. This is an actual Springfield Armory one. This, at least the receiver is. A lot of these parts, it's very, very rare and unusual to find a complete M1 Garand that's all the parts are made from the manufacturer or come from the manufacturer all as one, because these things were brought back in the country and rebuilt so many times because they were used so much. They were heavily, heavily used. But this one's pretty cool. The website I went back to and checked shows that this particular rifle was built in 1942. So it's pretty cool. Again, you can go back, you look up the make. I just looked up Springfield Armory, and you look up your serial number, and it will tell you what year that gun was produced and put out there. And you guys know me, I shoot everything that I own. Let's go shoot this thing. Now, before I get this thing all dirty, I want to show you something. If you guys will note, General Patton made the comment that the M1 Garand was the greatest battle rifle ever devised. And I got to believe that part of the reason for that was the ease of taking it down. No one had an excuse for not taking care of, at least from a field stripping level, of taking their firearm down and cleaning it. Let me show you how easy this thing is to clean. Of course, we just checked that it's clear. There's no there's no clip in there. All you do is you take your trigger guard here, pull it up. You see it right there. The whole trigger pack comes out. That gun's already trying to fall apart. And then you simply take the stock off of it, the wooden stock, and your receiver is all in one piece. Now, obviously, it's a little bit more detailed to take the entire receiver set down, but for the most part, if you took it down this far, you were cleaning all the main internals of this particular rifle. And it's just as easy and just as ridiculous at how easy it is for this thing to go right back together again. You simply put the trigger pack right back in, push the trigger guard, and it goes right back into place. Again, no excuses, guys, to have this thing dirty. No reason for it to be gummed up inside. Now, one thing that you may have heard of that you definitely want to avoid is the old Garand thumb. That's where, when you go to put your clip with your 8 rounds in it, you put it in here, and some people you will see will just shove it straight in. Well, when you shove it straight in, what happens is, as you're pushing down, you release the bolt. And that bolt will go forward. It'll take your thumb. What you want to do is, this thing here is not for looks. That bolt release is hooked like that for a reason. You put your hand on it like that. You use your hand to pull back, to hold back, and then you shove your clip down inside and it will go right in there. And once you get it down in there, you're still holding with your hand, and then you release the whole thing. Sometimes the bolt will go forward on its own. Sometimes you have to push it forward. But none of the time do you want your thumb in the way or any of your other 5 appendages on your hand. If you notice, that's our safe right there. You put your finger into the trigger guard, push it back out, it's off safe. That was kind of cool too. Obviously, you're not going to have your oversized trigger guard for your tactical gloves with this thing, unless you're going to be off safe all the time. I got a target out there at about 60 yards. Let's see what I can get with this 1942 Springfield Armory M1 Garand. I can barely see through that little hole too, guys. This is a wonderful thing to shoot, guys. Let me get some more of that. Yes, I love it. Pow! I am nailing that steel. Unbelievable. Wow. Love it. Go. I am shooting my Action Target PT I think it's PT Target. I'm not sure what the rest of it is. This thing here leans forward, and I am rocking that thing over there. I mean, it's at 60 yards away. This 30-06 round is putting a hurting on that target. It's not falling, but this is the closest I've seen to knocking that thing over, other than shooting at a point-blank range with buckshot. 60 yards, and it's rocking that thing. One thing that I've read about stories, this thing gets hot, okay? Now, it's got wood around it. This is not your standard polymer, aluminum, or steel that you see on most battle rifles today. This is wood. There are stories of guys in World War II and even the Korean War that were in such fierce battles and firefights, and they were able to reload and fire this thing so fast that the wood on their barrel actually caught fire. It got so hot. And I believe that because right now this thing it's hot to the touch, especially this front handguard right here. But yeah, the wood, it will actually catch fire. That's some amazing stuff that happened to that generation that really were a bunch of bad blanks, if you know what I mean. Friends, we have youth today that have no idea what the men and women that use these implements had to do, how they had to do it, and what they went through to fight for your and our freedoms back then whenever they used these tools. Our youth will never understand that. I don't understand it. I feel like I can try to put my mind where it is, but there's no way that I can actually put myself into the exact same situation mentally that our men and women did when they had to use these things to defend their lives. Times have changed, guys. We're never going to get back to the time when true men were true men. And I'm sorry, that's going to offend some people out there. I'm sorry because this is the made-up war on women, that suddenly all men are bad and all that kind of stuff. And if you're a manly man, that's bad. Look, I respect the people who did what they had to do with the tools that they had back then. An 8-round semi-automatic? Are you kidding me? That's what they had to defend themselves with. Look at the machinery that our guys have today. Thank God we have evolved to that point. The M1 Garand was one of the tools that made a lot of these men, and you and I especially, a lot freer and a lot safer today. Without rifles like the M1 Garand, you and I would probably be speaking a mix of Italian, German, and Japanese today. The M1 Garand is one of the finest implements ever devised, as General Patton once said. I totally agree with him. This is a beautiful firearm. This is a wall hanger. But you know what? These things were made so robust and so beautiful and so strong that you can shoot them today. I can shoot these things 70, almost 80 years after it was made, and it functions the same, and it is in no closer to breaking and malfunctioning today than it was 42 years ago. Yeah, it's been rebuilt, of course, but all the main components are all still here. What a beautiful rifle this is. If you ever have an opportunity to grab you one, do one. Guys, this is Memorial Day weekend 2019. I really want to give a big shout out to everybody out there that has served in the military, who currently serves, and I really want to tip my hat to the men and women out there who've lost their life for our safety and our freedoms here at home. We take our freedoms for granted every single day. Even people like me who think about the Constitution and amendments, Second Amendment, First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, but I still take them for granted. I don't realize, I've never been in a position like these men had to do back in the day of having to defend myself, knowing that the price I would pay would be giving up freedom if I didn't do what I had to do to protect my country. Hats off to those men and women who did it. Hats off to them. Hats off to them and their families. And for those of you out there that are serving today, doing what you had to do, hats off to you as well, because you're making as much a sacrifice as you can as well to look after our freedoms. Thanks, guys. I really appreciate that, and it means a lot to me as a free American.